last lap. Time of 24 hours has elapsed. This is the last lap.
Velocity falling off now.
The Le Mans race is the most famous endurance race in the world. It is a race that happens every year in the famous city of Le Mans in France. The race itself consists of 24 hours of endurance non-stop driving on the same vehicle, while teams have to push drivers to the limit while handling how much each driver rests, tire wear, fuel consumption, and mechanical faults in order to achieve the maximum glory. The racetrack at Le Mans is called Circuit de la Sarthe, which has received a share of changes throughout its history since the first Grand Prix in 1923, yet it still remains as one of the most recognizable circuits in the world. Many teams and categories are racing at the same time, so it should be considered as multiple races in one. So, when the race is won, it is not accredited to a single driver, but to the set of drivers plus the team as well. Since I will be going through a lot of information, and in order not to confuse everyone, I will be focusing on the major classes of each race and not that much on the subclasses. Each era had a different class, from the first years dividing the classes between engine size and the later ages dividing them by prototypes and GT classes. I will explain this when we get to that part, but as of now just take a look at this chart. This is an example of how each class was subdivided in the year 1931 and 1932, and as you can see, the cars have a category for engine size, minimum distance, average speed, equivalent laps for each class, and the minimum vehicle weight that was needed in order for the car to race at the track. Throughout all its history, there has been subcategory winners for each class. However, the most important one is the total race winner. Just two side notes before we get started. First, the race has a lot of categories and winners for each one. If we focus on each subcategory winner and its history, it will take us at least half a day to explain everything. So, in order to make things simple, I will focus on the most important one, which is the total race winner. That means the fastest team with the most laps. This will be my main focus as we develop into the later years. And for last, the footage for the first years of the race isn't that much available online compared to recent years where the race is broadcasted live. So I will try to picture the race as best and exciting as possible. The first instance of Le Mans was raced in 1923 with a different idea of the modern concept that we know of Le Mans nowadays. The inaugural Grand Prix was raced with over 20 car manufacturers competing, all of them from France, with the exception of a single Bentley and one Excelsior from Belgium, in a very rainy race. There were a lot of complications during its infancy years, as the Le Mans race was part of a yearly event cup that had multiple races. The race was led by the Bentley team and a French manufacturer called Chenard Walker, but it was the French team the one who ended up being crowned as the first winners of the Le Mans editions with André Lagache and René Léonard. There was major confusion at the boards, as the scorekeepers could not pinpoint who was on the right scoreboard, as it was very hard to track every car positions with the technology at the moment. So they came up with the idea of knowing each car positions by their average speed at the 24-hour mark. As you can see, this was not the best of ways to calculate who the winner was. An interesting fact about this race is that it was 25-hour long instead of 24, as the French had their summertime clock changed back in those years to add an extra hour. So the race started at 4 p.m. on a Saturday, but ended at 5 p.m. on Sunday. This was the year of the second Endurance Grand Prix. It was a tougher race than the first edition, as the weather was extremely hot and cars had to go to the extreme to finish the race. Only 12 out of 41 cars managed to finish the race. The winners of the last year race, Chenard Walker, were on the lead until the car caught fire. Then it was a battle between the Lorraine Dietrich team, which was a French team, and the Bentley team. Despite having 3 cars, the Lorraine Dietrich team had many mechanical issues, paving the way for the Bentley to get the first international victory and cemented the popularity of the race a significant event, with John Duff and Frank Clement driving the Bentley. 1925 was the year of the third race, and unlike the previous 2 years, it had a lot of changes. To stop the drivers from jumping the gun at the start of the race, they would be lined up on the opposite side of the track, and when the race started, they would run across to the cars. This became the origin of the famous Le Mans start, which was a standard until 1969, when it was not performed anymore due to safety concerns. The team that won the competition was the Lorraine Dietrich's team, with André Rossignol and Gerard de Courcelles as the drivers. I mentioned before that the average speed of the cars would influence the race results, didn't I? Well, this race is a clear example. The first place had 119 laps, while the second place was the British Sunbeam team with 117 laps, and the third place with 119 laps, the same as the first place and the third. It might sound confusing, but that's how the race was handled back then. Also, this would be the last time the Chenard Walker Manufacturing, which at the time was France's third biggest car manufacturer, would race in Le Mans, as it would be dissolved at the end of 1926 and faded away. This year saw the fourth Grand Prix of Endurance, and it was the first Le Mans race where the winner won with an average speed of over 100 km an hour, roughly 62 miles an hour. This year saw some new changes. Peugeot entered the competition, the absence of the team Chenard Walker, and also there was extensive construction of grandstand and spectator facilities. From the start, the Peugeot set the pace, chased by the previous winners Bentley and the Lorraines. As the other cars experienced mechanical issues, the Lorraine Dietrich took this advantage to push forward, with Bentley following them but failing at the last hour as the car of the driver Sammy Davis ended in a sandbank. After this, the Lorraine Dietrich team, led by the previous year winner André Rossignol, finished with an emphatic 1-2-3 finish, with André becoming the first person to ever win more than 2 Le Mans Grand Prix. The fifth Grand Prix was absent of many big manufacturers, but it was mostly known for its White House crash, which is named after some white buildings on the side of the road, henceforth the name. The race was started with an honor lap by its previous winners, Lorraine Dietrich, and it continued normally until it reached 9 p.m. when it started drizzling. A car from the Schneider team, raced by Pierre Tabourin, was pushing to make up time, and he spun at the tricky Maison Blanche or White House curves approaching the pits as he was being overtaken, and the car hit the barriers, ending in the middle of the road out of the sight of the following cars in the growing darkness. The S sequence of curves was narrow and fast, with the view of the exit obscured by the distinctive white farmhouse that gave the name to it. As the cars were arriving, it was going to be an impending chaos. The first to arrive was the leader Callingham, and while trying to avoid the car, he slid and he hit the fence with such force that he was thrown out of the car and into the middle of the road. The next driver, George Duller, seeing the danger, jumped out of his car before the impact. Over 5 more cars suffered damage in the car pile. Amazingly, the only injury was to the Schneider driver Pierre Tabourin, who suffered a broken arm and ribs. Despite being one of the cars who was also involved in the aftermath of the White House crash, the Bentley of Sammy Davis came back to win the Grand Prix, which was denied to him the previous year. The sixth Grand Prix saw the arrival of many British and American teams, which outnumbered the French ones for the first time, as they had been the predominant ones in the previous years. A new regulation on weight specified a minimum dry weight for each car depending on the engine size. Also, roadside picket fencing was put up at all spectator access areas, and the public PA system now covered all these areas as well. I have been mentioning up until now some examples of the minimum lap required by cars, which was a minimum distance set depending on the car's engine size. Well, ironically, this year saw the introduction of the coupe à la distance, which rewarded the car that traveled the furthest. Also, to prevent another White House event, the race organizers resurfaced the track and reflectors were put on the corners for better awareness at night. The race was a one-on-one duel between the Bentley and the Stutz as they traded positions throughout the night and into the morning. With the two teams suffering mechanical issues, it was the Bentley team driven by Bernard Rubin, the one that took the win at the end. This was the 7th Grand Prix, and it was a really uneventful race, with the Bentley winning the first 4 places, and with the previous year winner Bernard Rubin retiring at lap 7. No new regulations were introduced, with only a small change to the track that reduced its size by almost 920 meters. By the time of this race, it was a little too early for teams to know of the impending economic crash that would happen in October of that year. This would affect the grid for the next race. The 8th Grand Prix saw the first time a German car participating in the first entry for female drivers. This was also the smallest ever start in Le Mans history, with only 17 starters, mostly due to the 1929 economic crash. The regulations this year allowed private entrants to enter the competition. To be eligible, a privateer had to drive a car with a minimum of 30 vehicles that had been produced and sold. This race was led by a battle between Mercedes and Bentley, until Mercedes retired at 1:30 a.m. After that, it became a Bentley dominant race, with them taking the third consecutive win. Wolf Barnado repeated his victory of the previous year, co-driven this time by fellow countryman Sir Henry Tim Birkin. They had led from start to finish, setting a new distance record and lap record. The biggest news of the 9th Grand Prix was the absence of Bentley, so the favorite team to win this year was Bugatti, who finished 7th on the last race and broke headlines, and also the Alfa Romeo teams with a small Mercedes in between. It started with only 26 cars, but the race was a hard-fought one with tire wear on all cars. One Bugatti lost control and hit 3 spectators through a fence, unfortunately killing one. Bugatti ended up retiring all its remaining cars after this incident. It was the privateers, Earl Howe and Sir Tim Birkin, the previous year winner, driving the Alfa Romeo that won the race after a 1:30 a.m. thunderstorm had caused chaos in the race. 1932, the year of the 10th Grand Prix, saw the biggest changes in the circuit race history. There was a new section that was built starting with a long right turn after the pits, going over a hill and then down to the S's. We can see this in the iconic fast-paced turn at the start of the race. With this change, the track was shortened by almost 3 kilometers. One interesting fact is that previous to the race, the Talbot team, driving from England, had a car crash before the race, putting several of them in the hospital with minor injuries. The race was to be contested by the previous winners Alfa Romeo and the Bugattis, but it was a first lap accident by a Bentley at the tricky White House corners that caused a big disruption, with multiple cars crashing and ditching in the sandbanks. The Alfa Romeos then set the pace, but one had to get a windscreen fix at around 10 p.m. and the other Alfa Romeo had a blown gasket at 3 a.m. Not only that, but one of the Alfa Romeo drivers got a fever, leaving the other driver by himself and unable to do any more. The driver that got sick was Luigi Chinetti, and his companion was Raymond Sommer. Both of these would become rivals in the years to come, and you will hear a lot about them in this video. This delays allowed the Bugattis to catch up to them, but unfortunately, one of their cars stopped 4 laps short of the end. This took pressure off the Alfa Romeos, which took a 1-2 finish. The driver that drove by himself for 20 hours was privateer Raymond Sommer, who took his first win this year. 5 strong privateer entries from the Alfa Romeo team marked the start of the 11th Grand Prix, and this race remains as one of the narrowest racing finishes at Le Mans. The Italian cars set a strong pace, with the one driven by Raymond Sommer, the previous year winner, breaking the track record several times. Sommer was teamed up with future Italian hero Tasio Nuvolari, who would come to fame by his friendship with Benito Mussolini. At around 7 a.m., rain caused driver Odette Sico, a French female driver who had won the 2-liter class last year, to have a serious accident on the Indianapolis corner. The car was wrecked as it was plowed into the trees, while Odette was thrown out of the car, lightly injured. During the last 8 minutes of the race, as the Alfa Romeo of Nuvolari and Sommer needed more repairs, their lead vanished and it became an equal race at the end with Luigi Chinetti, the driver that was paired with Sommer last year and which retired due to fever. Going on to the last lap, the cars were really close and the lead changed 3 times. Greater speed allowed Nuvolari to overtake at the straights, but better brakes allowed Chinetti to repass at the corners. Finally, under great pressure from Chinetti, he made the mistake, missing a gear change and running wide. Nuvolari took this chance and shot through. Up ahead, cars were crawling around and waiting for the leaders to pass in order to avoid doing another lap. The pair caught up to them coming out of the White House corner, and seeing Nuvolari race past, François Pacot and the other Alfa Romeo pull out to follow him, right into the path of Chinetti, who braked hard in order to avoid ramming into him. Chinetti was crucially balked, and that was all that Nuvolari needed in order to charge on to take the victory by the slimest of margins, only 10 seconds or barely 400 meters after 24 hours of racing. Although Raymond Sommer was the one that drove 15 out of the 24 hours, it was Nuvolari the one that broke the headlines because of the dramatic finish. Moving on to 1934, this year marked the 12th Grand Prix. It was a race that saw a huge economic recovery as it was reflected with 44 entries. Not since 1925, during the 3rd Grand Prix, had there been so many starters. This race became another Luigi Chinetti versus Raymond Sommer race, with Luigi Chinetti finally taking the win that he narrowly lost the previous year. Luigi Cinetti's second victory at Le Mans was notable for his outstanding driving and his pit crew ability to produce chewing gum on demand to stem the flow of fuel from a fractured fuel tank. Nobody guessed at that moment that chewing gum would fix a tank. However, the brightness of the pit crew was able to fix Luigi Cinetti's car and allowed him to take his second victory. Driving an Alfa Romeo 8C 2300 with Philippe Etancelin, this was to be the Alfa Romeo's final victory at Le Mans. Having won the race every year since the 9th Grand Prix in 1931, Alfa Romeo had started out as favorite. The track was soaking wet as the race started, with Raymond Sommer grabbing the lead but abandoning later when he was hit by his fuel supply problems. In the early morning, two of the Alfa Romeos broke down, leaving just one in the race, and the Lagonda team racing car, which later would be acquired by Aston Martin, took the lead of the race. With 20 minutes to go, the commentator announced that the Alfa had moved in front of the Lagonda. To spare his mechanics, the Alfa was advised to ease off the pace. However, with mere 5 minutes of the race left, the officials realized that there had been a mistake, and then realized that the Alfa Romeo wasn't in the lead. It was trailing behind the Lagonda by 8 kilometers. The Lagonda team won the race and broke the long-standing record of the Alfa Romeos. Unfortunately, in 1936, the 14th Grand Prix was cancelled because of a general workers' strike in France that year. A lack of workers to modify the streets and prepare the race meant that unfortunately the race had to be called off. The 15th Grand Prix was highlighted by a large entry and a huge crash. This was the first time that the marshals used colored flags, which is the same system we use today. This year regulations allowed all cars to have only 2 seats. However, manufacturers were required to have produced at least 30 identical cars. The huge crash that I mentioned happened on the 8th lap, when an amateur Bugatti driver named René Coppert lost control and rolled several times, coming to rest in the middle of the road, causing mayhem with the incoming cars. With his car laying on the middle of the track, it was hit by the incoming BMW. His body was then thrown out of the car and laid 100 meters from the wreck. He died instantly. Over 6 cars crashed, with another driver named Pat Fairfield passing away in the hospital 2 days later. Despite this horrific accident, the other Bugatti, the one that was not involved in the accident, was the one that ended up winning the race with the driver Jean-Pierre Wimel. The 16th Grand Prix saw 28 out of the 44 entrants being French. Again, it was Raymond Summers who was in the lead for most of the race until he suffered a mechanical failure once he was 12 laps in the lead. It was the Delahaye team, the one that took the lead and brought a 1-2 finish to the race, being the only time that this team would win a Le Mans race. The late 1930s saw the start of research into aerodynamics. With its curves to the front and a taper shape to the rear, the winning Bugatti was dubbed the Tank. Jean-Pierre Wimel would again take the win as it did back in 1937 alongside Pierre Veyron. An interesting fact is that Bugatti paid homage to Pierre Veyron by naming the powerful Bugatti Veyron after him. The 17th Grand Prix, unknown to everyone attending the race, was only few months away from World War II, and this would be the last time the 6 nations, France, Italy, Great Britain, Belgium, Germany, and the United States would convene together for many years to come. From here on, it would be a 10-year halt for the race, while the race saw itself unfold in the next 6 years in what would be the worst war in human history. The race was not resumed until the 18th Grand Prix in 1949, after major infrastructure had to be rebuilt throughout France, which meant the race was a secondary concern. During the war, the Luftwaffe had used the circuit as a temporary airstrip, therefore making it a target for Allied bombing. It was 4 years after the war that the country was in a position to revive the great race again. Assisted with money from the government, the pits and the grandstand had to be rebuilt. However, one section of the race was still off limits and had not yet been cleared of landmines. With this, we wrap up the first part of the first years of the Le Mans 24-hour endurance race, with 1939 being the last time many racers would compete, and with 1949 starting a new chapter in the racing history. This pre-war era, from 1923 to 1939, will always be marked as the start of what would be the most famous endurance race in human history. I tried to make this first part as complete as possible, despite having limited data from those years. As we move forward to the later years, the videos will be packed with more information as we get closer to our current year. I welcome you to check my other videos, and if you do have a recommendation, make sure you leave a comment below as well as a like and subscribe. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next part.